Hey folks, it's Dan. This is episode 83 of the Podcast Digest, a big one. I know you've already seen the show title, guests of mine who I've been looking forward to speaking to for a very, very long time. It is the Kitchen Sisters from Fugitive, Raves, and Radiotopia, and so many other things. But before we get to that, I wanted to come on and just thank you guys for listening and ask you that if you've not heard yet or you've not considered becoming a Patreon for the Podcast Digest, I'm really interested in taking the show to a whole new level. But to do that, I'm going to need your help. I'm going to need to be able to push off some other things that I do and be able to focus more time on this show. I love doing it. I hope that you love listening to it. And I think that with your help, we can really make something very special and take this thing to a whole nother level. So there's a link in the show notes. There's a link on the website. It's Become a Patron, thepodcastdigest.info, upper left-hand corner. If you do support the show, there are plenty of different rewards and shout-outs and different things that I'd be willing to give you in return. So please just take a moment and consider becoming a patron for the Podcast Digest. It would really, really mean a lot to me. And if that's not up your alley, completely understand. The show will continue as normal. Maybe just tell a friend or tweet about it yourself if you enjoy what you hear, or a review on iTunes. It would all be greatly appreciated. That's it for now. I don't want to hold up this excellent conversation any longer. So let's get to my conversation with the Kitchen Sisters. Enjoy. All right, folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. As I mentioned up front, my guests this week are ones that I've heard from a lot of you that you would really love to hear from, and it's truly an honor to me to be able to talk to these two individuals who have been in the radio production, storytelling, podcasting game probably longer than any of my other guests, and because of that, I'm really interested in kind of picking their brains a little bit on some of their experiences. Folks, welcome to the Podcast Digest, the Kitchen Sisters, Davia Nelson and Nikki Silva. Davia and Nikki, welcome.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
Well, the pleasure's all mine, honestly, and as I mentioned, I have heard from folks who wanted to have you guys come and talk to me, and that's a feeling that I definitely can understand. You guys have been doing this for so long and have had put out so many wonderful stories that have been some of the best things I've ever heard, honestly, and that's not because I'm talking to you. Before we jump into some of that, though, I'd like folks to get to know you guys a little bit, maybe pre-radio storytelling days. So let's begin first with, how did you two meet?
We had both been living in Santa Cruz, going to UC Santa Cruz, but we hadn't met there. And both of us had graduated. This is Davia, by the way. And I had started doing radio at UC Santa Cruz on KZSC, the campus radio station. And then after graduating, I got a tape recorder and a cassette recorder and a microphone and started walking around town doing oral histories, with looking for old people to tell the stories of Santa Cruz and the region. And almost everywhere I would go, whoever I was talking to, they would say, "Oh, do you know this girl, Nikki Silva? She was here just the other day and she was collecting my baskets," or "She was looking at my paintings," or "She was wanting to see our scrapbooks." And so I started to hear rumor of this other gal who wasn't doing radio, but was walking the same path, but for the local museum and the local history. And then a friend of mine, this guy I was going out with at the time, started to telling me about Nikki as well, once he saw what I was doing with recording all these oral histories. And he said, "You know, Nikki Silva, you should really go meet her." So I called her up at the museum and went over on a sunny day, and it was in the afternoon, and we began, which was supposed to be probably like a half hour, "Hi, how are you? Let's see those baskets you've been collecting." And next thing we knew, I think 5 hours later, we were still talking. The sun was setting, and it was just one of those epiphanies where you just feel like you found a soulmate. And we just kind of basically began doing radio together from that point on.
Wow. And what year was this?
God, I think it's 79. It's 78, 79, right around there.
Right. We talk about this a lot. What year was that? I think it was 1978, and we really started working together, we decided, yes, we both want to do oral history. We were sort of passionate about it, and we didn't quite know how to do it, but we decided we were just going to jump in and launch into it. And Davia was doing a live show on the local radio station KUSP at the time. And so the two of us began sort of going out into the community and doing these oral histories with sort of anybody we could find that we thought had an interesting story, farmers and fishermen and Italian grandmothers. And then we would come back to the studio and we'd play music and interview people live on the air. And that was kind of the beginning of our work together and sort of experimenting. It was like a lot of experimentation in that day because no one at our radio station was really doing production in a big way. And so we taught ourselves how to cut the tape because we quickly realized nobody wanted to listen to the 18 hours of interview we just did with Lola Galley, the champion cowgirl in San Benito County. So we figured we better cut it down to size and started to cut with a razor blade and quarter-inch tape and little Scotch tape that you'd put it together with, and that was how we started.
This sounds like, and I have heard you guys talk about the cutting of the tape before. This process back in 78 or 79 was obviously much more intricate, time-consuming, and required more skill than maybe today. And I guess there's an argument to be made there. But my question is, with all that was involved in going around and collecting these oral histories, talking to, I imagine, fellow students or other people in town, what do you guys think it was that sort of prompted you to have such an interest and passion for collecting this information and ultimately getting to the point of publishing? Nikki, you want to start?
Well, I think both of us have just been so compelled by story forever. I think we both kind of come from families where that was kind of major. And my mom was a great storyteller with just lots of stories about the family that kept me on the edge of my seat. And, Davia's dad used to just take her around and introduce her to the world, to the sort of the backs of kitchens and restaurants and the newsstands, and just listening and kind of taking in the world through other people's points of view. And I just think that there was something about what we were both doing. I was doing museum work. This is Nikki. At the time, but really it was the same thing. It's kind of storytelling, but in a different format. It's the same idea, listening and putting things together in new ways and cutting them down and kind of making them your own, but essentially kind of giving a voice to something that most people don't have a chance to hear.
This is Davia. Can I just add one thing before I answer, for our listeners? If you're hearing buses going by and loudspeakers and trucks and traffic, our San Francisco offices are right on the border of North Beach, the Italian neighborhood, and Chinatown. And we're in Francis Coppola's building, the old Zoetrope building, such a beautiful thing. But it is the convergence at the confluence of 3 fire stations, a tour bus, and so there'll just be lots of noise, but it hopefully gives it that wonderful sense of place. Just if you can imagine, you just go right up the street and you're at City Lights bookstore, Lawrence Ferlinghetti's bookstore, where Howl was first published, Allen Ginsberg's piece. Anyway, I just know there's trucks and whatnot going through all this tape. I would also say, for me, my mother died when I was a little girl, and kind of the circumstances of her death and then kind of what happened afterwards, a lot was kept secret from us. And my grandmother, her mother, she was an only child, and we are Jews from Russia. But my grandmother, her mother, decided that being a Russian Jew, you couldn't be a millionaire in America. And once she got here and had been here for a while and was with my grandfather, who was a bookie and had a little diner, she thought she could do better. And she divorced him, and she reinvented herself and made herself into a Christian Scientist from Finland, created a whole new identity. And so she could never tell family stories because she was living out someone else's life, looking for a bank president to marry, which she ultimately did. So I think my thirst for finding story came from the stories that I didn't hear in my family and the people that I couldn't ask. And so it just created, if I couldn't learn my own family, I would need to know everybody else's story.
That's excellent. And that certainly sort of explains where the two of you have come together with this passion. Because I wonder, like you said, there was not as much of this type of storytelling going on, with you guys in college and thinking about doing something like this. It had to be, did you have the feeling at the time that it was somewhat trailblazing, or at least it had to be very much different than most of the people in your class?
Well, we were both in Santa Cruz then, and so NPR had just, was new, but it wasn't even in our area. I mean, there was Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, and there was long form FM, that was in the 70s that was playing the 10-minute versions of songs, and these sort of outrageous rhyming DJs and, outrageous Nevada, these great character DJs I grew up with in Los Angeles. And those were a lot of my heroes, but that wasn't oral history. That was just these sounds and rhythms and noises coming out of the radio, which possessed me. And in the beginning, for me, Davia, I wanted to be a disc jockey, just playing music. I either wanted to be the first woman on the Supreme Court or a disc jockey. And ultimately, I felt like Kitchen Sisters combined music and justice. And, it's okay. So Sandra Day O'Connor got there first, but, I feel like our work kind of speaks to both sides. But yeah, I don't think we'd been reading Studs, Turkle, both of us, but neither of us even realized he had a radio show at that point. We weren't really following other people at that moment. We were making something up in our own mind.
Well, there is an open seat right now in the Supreme Court, I heard. So I don't know if they're taking applications, but
Good point. I guess that healing the nation needs, the Kitchen Sisters.
I would want to hear the episodes coming out of Fugitive Waves after you're on the Supreme Court. Talk about hidden and lost audio. And well, Clarence Thomas is now asking questions, so you might be able to talk to him.
Right, exactly. We have a friend, this woman, Alice Waters. People might know her from the Edible Schoolyard and Chez Panisse, and she has been she got asked by one of the justices to even think about making a cafe for the Supreme Court, an organic cafe. So that was something we've been chronicling a lot of her work in food over the years as part of our Hidden Kitchen series. So I've been thinking about the Supreme Court from the angle of the kitchen for the last little while.
The Supreme Cafe.
So let's talk about the name. I'm sure folks want to know. You mentioned the Hidden Kitchen series, which has been awesome. I've listened to just about all of that. Where did the name originate, Kitchen Sisters?
Well, we were doing our live radio show that we were just talking about at KUSP, and we did a lot of kind of interviews with authors and filmmakers, along with the oral history stuff that we were doing. And we were preparing for an interview that we were going to do with this guy who had written a book about Santa Cruz architecture. And we were also at the same time trying to cook a meal. I had just moved out to a piece of land in Santa Cruz with about 5 or 6 other people, and we were starting a collective. We were building places to live, and we were in this old kitchen, and Davia and I had been given the responsibility to make a salmon dinner, and we were following through, but at the same time we were multitasking and preparing for our show and reading about architecture, and we're trying to find what's the hook. I'm sure you know this as a person who interviews a lot of people. What are we talking about with this guy? How can we make it come alive? And the one thing in this book that really caught our attention was the story of these two sort of eccentric stonemasons Robert and Kenneth Kitchen, the Kitchen brothers, who were in Santa Cruz in the 1930s and 40s. And they were just notorious, and they had all sorts of stories about them in this book, but it was kind of all hearsay, and they were wacky stories. And it was, these guys would build with abalone shells and brick and build by the light of the moon. And they built these towers that could send and receive messages to submarines that they thought were lurking out in Monterey Bay. This was during World War II, and sort of sending messages. And they had a yogi goat milk bar. And there were these bizarre sort of remnants of their work around town, including this one place called the Yogi Temple. Anyway, we were mesmerized. And as we were mesmerized, we completely blew the dinner. We burned the dinner. We ruined the dinner. And everybody at our dinner table was pretty miffed at the fact that we had just blown this dinner. And so the next day when we were on the air live with this guy, we were doing the interview, and we said, well, tell us about the Kitchen brothers, not to be confused with the Kitchen sisters who are in here with you today. And we just started to crack up, and a friend of ours heard the show and made these bumper stickers, "Free the Kitchen Sisters," and they were kind of given out around town, and it just became this name. And beyond sort of the story behind it, it was kind of what it came to mean. I mean, the kitchen, seemed perfect. It was sitting around the table talking. It's the most comfortable place in the house. It's where everybody always wants to be, to storytell and listen. And that kind of became what we were known as. And we started calling our show that. And it was great because we were interviewing a lot of older people at the time, too, who couldn't get our names straight. And the Kitchen Sisters was just a much easier way to go.
We didn't start doing food stories for another 25 years. It didn't trigger recipes and, the Hidden Kitchen series. It was much more sort of identifying with this eccentric piece of history and the brothers and having blown a meal. But it caught up to us ultimately. And
well, there's big news here in Santa Cruz. I live in Santa Cruz still, which is about 2 hours south of San Francisco. Davia is in San Francisco, and I'm down here, still on the commune. And the big news is the property, the Kitchen Brothers Yogi Temple property, just sold. I mean, it's been threatened for years. It was going to be torn down. It's this great big double lot. It's a beautiful, weird temple-looking Byzantine thing. But some people bought it, and they're going to restore it, and they're going to build some houses on the side of it, but keep it as it is. So that's the big news on the Kitchen Brothers from down here.
I find it somewhat ironic, as I'm sure you guys probably do as well, that the origin of the Kitchen Sisters was based, at least in part, on a kitchen failure. which is nice that it's kind of all come back around, that you guys got into the Hidden Kitchen series and some of the other recipe stuff you were talking about. But originally, it was a blown salmon dinner.
It was a blown salmon dinner, right?
I would bet almost all our colleagues and fellow producers and podcasters, if you really dug deep, you'd find that their experiments and their failures and their flops and their mistakes and their outtakes were actually where the inspiration so much of the time comes from. What's that, Dylan? No success like failure, and failure's no success at all. It's all kind of one, but it's like fail up, fail and fail again. I think Samuel Beckett said it's just out of that, you then see where you're trying to get. I mean, the whole Tupperware piece that we did, we were, like Nikki said, we were teaching ourselves to mix and teaching ourselves to cut and teaching ourselves to do sound design. There was really no one there besides us to do it. And that piece, as we've told the story before, was all one continuous mix. No one told us you could start and stop and cut things together. We thought, it was like one of those on your mark, get set, go kind of situations where we had 2 or 3 cassette recorders, 2 or 3 reel-to-reels, taping it down, and we were at the mixing board and getting all those levels right. And if you hear that cacophonous part in the center of the piece when all the women are talking about all the prizes and gifts they get from Tupperware, That's just one mistake after another, losing control of the mix, and everything starts popping up and cascading. And out of that cascade and cacophony came a whole aesthetic and a whole way of hearing. So cherish.
It was kind of this moment, too, where the sound of the piece really captured the subject, the narrative of the story, that somehow the chaos and the cacophony was like Tupperware. It was just crowded, packed rooms full of plastic bowls and laughing people and parties and, Tupperware conferences, and the sound really did mirror what we were trying to do in the piece, and we just kind of looked at each other and laughed. Yes, this is it.
You mentioned some of those failures and difficulties, of the early days, but I imagine there's others as well.
Yeah, there hasn't been one failure or difficulty since that mix in 70.
So that was it. That was the end of that story.
It's been nothing but blue skies ever since.
I was thinking, you guys have done so much field recording in so many remote or difficult locations to get to. I imagine in environments that were very challenging. I'm curious, for each of you, was there a story or two that ultimately got published and aired, but while you were putting it together, you were convinced that this might not happen for whatever the reason?
I sort of feel that way almost with every piece. It's just kind of, is this going to work? Is this working? Is this working? Can we make this work? I think it's part of, for me anyway, it's part of that process of refining and winnowing and, getting down to the essence, the espresso of it all. It's just such a questioning process. Sometimes it just clicks and you just know it. I mean, usually that happens with a part of something that you're doing, like you'll get this little moment, this glimmer, and you'll go, there it is, okay, it's going to be okay. But it's definitely a process for me.
Yeah, I'm kind of scrolling in my mind through Moscow, Siberia, Palermo, Jerusalem, Beirut, just so, native, the Ojibwe White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, Montgomery, Alabama. I see, when you ask that question, Dan, I kind of see before me these just gorgeous moments of sonic perfection, and where the recordings are so beautiful and there's just the right amount of bird song in the background or soft breeze. And then I see either gale winds or I see checkpoints in the occupied Palestinian territories where if they saw your microphone, you'd have everything stripped away, or, thieves chasing you, or you're worried about the mafia, or, there's just so many reasons to, getting the sound equipment, post 9/11 when we were doing the Sonic Memorial Project, and even getting the sound equipment through security at that point, coming in and out of New York so much for that project. So there's just, each one it's just kind of gorgeous moments, and then it's terrifying or messy. A lot of situations you think are going to be your favorite. Oh my God, we got backstage passes to go interview who, you name it, some person, some artist you respect so much that seems so critical to the piece, but you got a backstage pass and you forgot that the sound backstage is so noisy you can't even hear the person you're talking to, let alone the fact that there's a piece of music playing behind him. And so you can't cut the tape either. So it's like, be careful what you wish for, or the winds come up suddenly, or the generator clicks on, or there's just so mmany situations that just seem like they're going to be perfect and beautiful. And then just somehow you're interviewing the person in their car and you think, okay, because that's the only quiet place you can find. And then suddenly the dings of the car alarm keep going off and they won't. I mean, it's ridiculous to the sublime. Or someone gets forbidden to talk to you. There's someone who's whistleblowing in some way or trying to say something that's hard for a family to talk about. They start speaking and someone walks in and suddenly they feel tongue-tied and you're a witness to that. There's so many ways it can go sideways.
You mentioned the Sonic Memorial Project. In a library full of important and meaningful stories, I can't help but think that was somewhere near the top of that list. And I was wondering, how difficult was that to put together, to interview those folks, to produce? It had to be one of the toughest things. Or did you guys look at it differently?
Yeah, it was really one of the toughest things, and it was one of the most profound things. I mean, Nikki really, this is Davia, and Nikki really had that in her bones. She felt so strongly. We were doing the Lost and Found Sound series on All Things Considered, which was this massive, sprawling collaboration with thousands of radio producers and listeners and archivists and collectors and all over the country. You know, it was marking the turn of the century in sound. And right, you know, then at 2001 comes September 11th, and we had already been galvanizing so many people and collecting so much sound and seeing what these lost recordings meant to people. And we had been using phone messages in our stories because we had opened up these phone lines on All Things Considered, asking the nation to call in, and thousands of people had called with their messages about their treasured recordings, their unusual recordings, their sonic artifacts. And so we started thinking about we were obsessed with voicemail at that point, and we were kind of really obsessed with that sound. And we started thinking, and here we were on the West Coast, and everyone was thinking, how can they help, and what do you have to offer? And we started thinking the buildings might be down, but maybe that voicemail system still is up, and still because we knew what to have someone's voice meant. We had just seen a whole year of stories based on these recordings that had been collected by people around the world for over 100 years. So we thought, well, maybe we could help seeing if the voicemail system, because voicemail usually isn't in the same building, it's on a server. And so we reached out. It was Verizon. We found ourselves reaching out to Verizon to see, and this was now maybe 10 days after 9/11, to see if they had, quote, the term we learned was janitored, if all those messages had been erased, because there were those automatic erasing systems. And we got Verizon to stop erasing the messages. We got a program going with Verizon at that point to make copies of the voicemail messages of people in the buildings. And so that was the first piece of the Sonic Memorial Project. And then we just started thinking about it from there. We opened up the phone lines again on NPR, asking people for their recordings from that area of Lower Manhattan for the last 100 years, and to how to remember this building through sound. And it led to all those stories, and another 1,000 people that we collaborated with, all kinds of, Jad Abumrad, Joe Richmond, Ben Shapiro, Jay Allison, colleagues from all across the nation and around the world, and everyone who'd recorded those buildings and that ground for all kinds of iterations of it across the decades.
And it was, I think the process of producing, we produced those stories over the year after, and then we did them separately. They aired throughout the year, but then we did an hour-long piece for the first anniversary. And I think that whole year, it was just so much like the grieving process, that you go through, that they have in all the books. First year in shock, and then you're angry, and then you're so sad. And it just went through all of the cycles of emotion, and you could really feel that in listening to the interviews and listening to the messages from people who were calling in. And it was a really tough time. Davia did a lot of those interviews in New York. My mom was dying at the time, and it was just, it kind of couldn't have gotten worse on a lot of levels, just in terms of the obstacles and how emotional it all was. But I think that idea of building a memorial in sound, and the fact that we were so geared up and ready for it was pretty remarkable. Having this whole team in place for Lost and Found Sound, I don't think could have ever done it if we hadn't had that whole collaborative structure already in place. And the different stations we were working with, and NPR and the independent producers, and it was a remarkable moment.
I'm glad you built in the segue for Lost and Found Sound, because that was the next thing I wanted to talk about. And I want to do just a little personal story, if I could. Archival audio has been sort of a feature through the Lost and Found series, and now still in Fugitive Ways. It often makes it an appearance, this much older or recently discovered audio, and sheds new light on something that, or reminds people of something. And I'm reminded, and listener, if you are wondering about the impact of this, you mentioned about a passing parent. I lost my father when I was 7 years old, and one of the things that I have for some strange reason is an audio cassette of him and me before he passed away. It was a He-Man talk and listen tape that had an audio book that you would read through on one side, and on the other side, the big feature of this tape was it was blank, and you could record your own voice. So I actually have, 4 or 5 minutes of me and my father talking on the other side of this He-Man yellow cassette tape that I now keep in a locked fireproof box. And so that's just a little personal piece of what sort of, I imagine you guys are unearthing constantly. And I'm just sort of curious, what are your thoughts on some of this older audio, and what have you seen kind of come from working with this and publishing episodes and its impact?
Well, it's incredibly powerful. That's a beautiful story. You're so lucky to have that little tape. That's a great thing. I mean, there is just something about the voice. We were lucky enough to interview Sam Phillips of Sun Records, and the man who discovered Elvis, and Johnny Cash, and about 1 million other greats. And he's been a real mentor of ours, and his whole relationship to the sound of someone's voice, and he just articulated that so beautifully to us over and over. There's just something about it, the breath and the life, and it was really in our very earliest days on the radio, we came across this recording in my dad's garage. My dad was a notorious pack rat, and he had a lot of 78s, and we were going to play them on our show. And we pulled this one record, 78, out of the pack, and it was handwritten. It said, "To Louie, love Mrs. B. Louie, play this side first." And I looked at that and I thought, I said to my dad, "Who is this?" My dad's name was Ernie. "Who's Louie?" My dad didn't have a clue, and we never really found out who it was. But you could make these home recordings. In the 30s and 40s, they had record players that actually could be used as recording machines back then too, and cut into a disc. And during World War II, these were really popular, and a way that people sent recorded messages back and forth to each other. And this record from Mrs. B to her husband overseas in London was so evocative. I mean, it completely floored us. Everything about this woman's speech, the way she, her intonation, her choice of words, you could read those things on a page, but you would never, ever really truly know or feel them the way you could by hearing her in that moment. And the tentativeness and the love and the fear and all of those things. She was talking to him and she said, "Do they jitterbug over there, honey? I guess they're not half as cute as we are they, hun?" And just all of this insecurity. And it completely inspired our work. And it was the thing that we began looking everywhere and saying out loud, "Do you have any home recordings?" and looking in Goodwill and finding them. And we put together shows with these old recordings. And it was really one of the inspirations for Lost and Found Sound, because there is a big, big difference between reading someone's words and hearing it from their heart.
Have you guys ever come across audio and found out something that, that either made you guys look at a particular sort of known situation differently, or shed new light on something that you didn't read in a history book? And if so, while you're putting together that episode, is there this feeling of anticipation that you guys are about to pull back the curtain and give a whole new perspective on this maybe somewhat known event and know that you're shedding a light on it that no one has ever seen before. I'm thinking a lot about your WHER, the 1,000 Watts of Power, if I'm getting the titles correctly here, which was amazing couple of episodes to me. It was totally eye-opening and brought on an understanding of radio's history that I had no idea of. Yeah,
that had that same effect on us. I mean, there we were it was right on the edge of starting Lost and Found Sound. And, this is Davia. I was, Nikki's other life is, museums and my other life is film. And I was doing, I was in the casting department on Francis Coppola's film, The Rainmaker, which was shooting in Memphis. And I was on the set one day and the furniture was just such a knockout. And I wound up getting, in conversation with this guy who I'd never seen on the set before. I don't know how well people know Memphis, but the men and the women there really have some hair going on. There is Memphis hair, and this guy had a head of hair. And we started talking. And it turned out he was on the set that day because the furniture came from his father's office. And as Nikki was just telling you, it turned out that it was from his father. He said, well, this come from my father's office. And we just started talking about sound. We started talking about music. We started talking about food. And Nikki and I were just dreaming up Lost and Found Sound. And I started telling him about this vision we had for this project, Lost and Found Sound, covering the sound of the nation. And he said, well, then you're really going to have to come meet my father because he was the first one to record Elvis Presley. And you're going to have to come meet my mother because he started the first all-girl radio station in the nation for my mother and all these first women disc jockeys. And it turned out it was Sam Phillips. So, this one little sentence, this one little random conversation opened Pandora's sonic box. And there we suddenly were finding out that with Sam Phillips, from the money that he got from selling Elvis Presley's contract in 1955, he opened up the first all-girl radio station in the nation in the third Holiday Inn ever built. And we just began unearthing and finding names. And Sam and Becky, his wife, and Sally, his girlfriend, helped lead us one to another to another. I think we started out maybe knowing 7 of these women, which led to 14 women, which led to 21 women, which led to 28 women. It's been now, years and decades of unfolding and uncovering the story, these little known Southern sonic pioneers, these just incredible women who were breaking down all the barriers, but in such a kind of unexpected way. It's not where you would think this movement would start. And we were so lucky because Becky Phillips had held on to the record library and a lot of the women still had air checks. So we were able to bring it to life.
And the other really remarkable thing about that time, too, was interviewing those women. I mean, they just became it was like looking at your family tree for us, kind of. Oh, these are the women that came before. There were these women that came before, and they had all the same issues and the same problems. And that, and then their children were also often there when we were interviewing them, and their children knew nothing of this part of their mother's lives, which was truly beautiful to be able to kind of give them some attention and get them the recognition that they so deserved, and to get their stories out there. Their children were so amazed and grateful to learn all these great things about their moms.
It sounded like to me, listening to that, and I mean this in the most complimentary way, it sounded like the radio version of A League of Their Own. It really did, especially when you say about how their children know. In that movie, A League of Their Own, you see at the reunion at the end, a lot of them are talking to their children or grandchildren, and a lot of them didn't know that their mother or grandmother played baseball all these years ago, and it became this big eye-opening thing. And it's sort of the parallels for that are many, I think.
We're working on a Broadway musical right now based on that story. So hopefully,
oh wow,
people will be able to go to that in our lifetime.
that would be amazing. Changing gears a little bit, talking about sort of the early part of your career, if you will, let's say, 70s and 80s into early 90s, and sort of the second half, if you will, breaking sort of the time you guys have been in radio and storytelling production in half. Are there some things sort of in the medium, in radio storytelling and audio production that occurred in the first half that you're happy have been improved nowadays, or are there some things that maybe you miss about the older way of doing things?
I mean, what I've always loved, the through line for me is the community and the fellowship of people in sound, people in radio. I always say God loves radio. I just feel like, and radio is a state of mind as much as it is a thing. And when I say radio, I mean podcast. I don't have this big separation. I'm talking about people possessed by sound and by story and by the need to investigate or uncover or reveal and layer the sound and use their voice in some mesmerizing ways, or chronicle something that might slip away if they don't do it. And then they're adding, archival audio and field recordings and frosting it and layering it. And I mean, it's just such an incredible tribe. To me, even there's, the analog years, there's the hardly anybody's doing it years, there's the, more people are doing it years, we're independents, we're not on staff years. There's there's so many different versions of it across the time. The podcast's been invented. I remember the first conference we went to over a decade ago where Nikki had seen the word podcast and she had to go to this session and find out what it was. I mean, just, she was looking, so there's, just those reveals of new technology, or when suddenly everyone is emailing each other, the technology and the forms change. But I think for me, that feeling of being in a room, whether you were at the PRCs, the big public radio conferences, or the Third Coast, or in the dark in London, or Airlie in the old days at Larry Joseph's, if you were lucky, you just got to get yourself once or twice a year, 3 times a year to these gatherings, these tribal powwows of like-minded people, and sit in rooms and, digest each other's stuff and do the forensics on it and present and be inspired. I mean, that's for me the big deal of it, along with just, having the backstage pass that being a producer gives you, walking through life with a microphone and recording equipment. It gives you, I think Jay Allison said this, it gives you a passport, it gives you the entree. We always say our microphone is a stethoscope, listening to the complicated heart of the nation. It's a Geiger counter. It's a divining rod. It's just this way into life.
What do you think, Nikki? Over the years, anything that you've seen that has kind of improved for the better, or something that you're happy to leave behind, or is there kind of that through line like Davia was talking about?
I think it's a through line. I mean, I actually think it goes, it's back to the earliest days of it for me. I mean, from working in museums. I mean, it's that storytelling. It's finding that story, hearing. It's listening and really hearing. And then that urge to share the story in the most compelling way. I don't feel any of that's changed. The tools have changed, but I don't think the heart of it has changed for us. I don't think it has.
Well, more people have access.
More people have access now, which is great, which is good. And I think there's more experimentation and pushing it. So I think it's kind of an interesting ride. It's watching where it is fast changing. That's for sure right now. All that's going on, and it's becoming ever more popular.
Speaking of all that's changing, and I want to look forward. We've been looking back a little bit. Let's look forward, and I want to bring up a previous guest first because I know she's a huge fan of yours, and two, I'm curious your thoughts on a topic that her and I discussed several episodes back, Dana Gerber Margie. She is an independent, huge podcast fan and has a newsletter called The Audio Signal. And when I had her on my show, we recommended some podcasts, but we also talked about a topic that she's very passionate about because her day job is she is an audio archivist for the state of Wisconsin. So she is very big into audio archiving, and this is what she does all day, every day, is deal with the transcripts and the audio archiving for the state. But she has expressed a lot of concerns, and what we talked about on our episode a lot was sort of what podcasters could do today to make sure that 50 years from now that their audio and their episodes could be secured and safe for that future audience, generations to come. Do you guys think there's enough being done with the audio that we're all constantly producing, that we're producing right here and right now? Or do you think, or do you have concerns? You guys have looked back and been able to obtain so many things. What about 50 years from now when folks are looking for what we're doing?
Well, we've been really concerned about that and interested in it for a long time. I mean, we have this enormous accidental archive. I mean, we never started out thinking that we were amassing an archive, but we certainly have. And, all the raw interviews, we usually do, 20, 30 hours for a short segment, that all of these original interviews plus the finished pieces. A few years ago, we started working with some women from the graduate school of the E-School. What's it called, Dave? It's not the library school, but the electronic school or the
iSchool.
iSchool, Information School, that's right. Information School at UC Berkeley. And they are the creators. I mean, they came to us, they said they really wanted to start developing some kind of an archiving system for audio. And they worked with us for a couple of years, and now they are doing this wonderful project called Pop-Up Archive. You might want to have them on your show, because they are really making some big strides and waves in the archiving of audio world. And, this is a searchable thing. People can put their stuff up there. It's safe. It's has transcription capabilities. So there are people working out there. But, it's one of those weird things, because every time we do anything, I feel this, oh my gosh, okay, we got to put it here, we got to put it there, we got to back it up there, we got to put it up there. And it's still that, and that's that. Like, I'm always so afraid to erase things off of the chips, off of the memory cards. I still go through that every single time, because they say that one of the most stable forms of audio are the old 78 records that we kind of began working with in those early days. And we've got just about everything in between. We've got the cassettes, and we've got the mini discs, and we've got the DATs, and now we've got the computers and the memory cards, and it's just going to keep on going. So I think that format issue is huge, and I'm glad there are people out there thinking about it. I think all of us should be figuring out ways to safeguard the audio.
Absolutely. And yeah, especially for a lot of the episodes and the interviews that you guys have put together, I can imagine that has got to feel extraordinarily valuable to conserve and protect for years to come. Let me ask you guys this. Let me ask you, both of you, if you would, on this one, because I think this is an important question, because I'm going to guess that this is going to fit for at least a couple of the listeners out there. You guys have broken through, let's say, some glass ceilings, have been an idol of many, I'm sure. I've heard your names revered from several of my previous guests, but I'm curious if there is a 10 or 11-year-old listening to this interview right now because they just found the Kitchen Sisters, they love Fugitive Ways, they've subscribed, and they heard that you guys were coming on here to talk. If you could give advice to those guys, if they want to become the next Kitchen Sisters, boys or girls, what would you tell them? One
thing I might say is don't be afraid to collaborate. I think collaboration is inspiring. If you can find a partner, if you can find people to work with, it can really push you in ways that you might not go alone. And I'd say that. And And it's work. I think a lot of it is work. It's a skill. You know this from your work. You don't just automatically know how to do everything. It's not easy. It's work and attention to detail. And it's every time you finish something, kind of evaluating it in your mind and saying, okay, how could I do that better last time? What did I do wrong? What did I do right? What do I want to do again? And asking people for feedback and being able to kind of take that in and kind of work from there. And that it's fun. I mean, that it's fun and have fun and don't be afraid to experiment and don't try to sound like everybody else. I mean, just try to find you. I think that was one of the great gifts for us is there weren't a lot of people doing what we were doing at the time. So the temptation wasn't there to just try and sound like someone who was succeeding. I think more and more that's the case now. But there's lots of room, I think, to experiment and push it out there.
Yeah, I think I look at Lena Dunham, or I look at Broad City, or even Elise Spiegel and Lulu doing Invisibilia, and I just think you couldn't ask for anything more to go through life. What's that Studs Terkel quote? Tape everything, or he said, I taped everything that moved. Tape everything that moves. You just to have that heightened sense. And I always think you will not be lonely in life if you know how to play music, if you know how to cook, or if you tell stories. There is always a place for you at every table. And I feel like people in life, so many people are looking for that place to belong, trying to see sort of how you enter into mysterious and new and provocative situations and scary situations and mesmerizing moments. And I think if you're a girl and you're tempted by this, I think also you have the world will tell you things that it might not tell somebody else. And you maybe have a sensibility that somebody else might not have. And it's a really beautiful moment to pick up a mic and go forth and tape everything that moves.
So this may be an unfair question, but I'm interested in knowing, and again, I imagine somebody listening is, with your experience and wonderful accomplishment, are there other creators, producers, hosts out there whose work that either of you have, great admiration for, love listening to yourself? Are there others out there? And it's not about picking favorites, just a couple that you guys have sort of podcast recommendations. That's kind of one of the things I do here, and work that people should be listening to that maybe they're not right now.
Well, definitely all of our Radiotopia colleagues. I mean, Radiotopia has been such an amazing group and kind of hand-picked and hand-curated, and Roman Mars and PRX have done such a great job sort of pulling together a really diverse group of sound artists, and also each program just has such a personality and identity of its own. I mean, there's something there for everyone. And Scott Carrier, I have to say, I always say Scott Carrier and Land of the Free, or Home of the Brave. What's his name? What's the name of his podcast?
I think it's Home of the Brave.
Home of the Brave.
Yes.
Scott Carrier for me is just, I love listening to Scott Carrier.
And Davia?
It's funny. At the minute, I am obsessed with the work of film sound designers. That's what I'm listening to right now. I don't know. I sort of have always felt like we sort of make movies. I feel like we shoot in close up, and all that layering of music and archival audio and sound and texture is visual. And so a lot of the time it's film sound that is where my ear goes. I've been listening to a lot of the work that Carter Burwell has done and how he weaves his music into story. And Walter Murch just obsesses me, and how he, what he does to a soundtrack, or Randy Tom, who just did The Revenant. And I don't feel like I have a secret. I mean, I'm a sucker for Marc Maron too. I have to say. I just love, and I don't feel like I have that secret insider track to tell our audience here of something they haven't heard about so much as, I would say, listen to the work of beautiful film sound designers. Just close your eyes and listen to a movie the next time you go and see what's there. That's where I'm at today.
Excellent. Well, ladies, I know we're running short on time here. I've got just one last question for you before I tell everybody to go subscribe to Fugitive Waves. And we hardly even touched on that. And that, like I said, I think that's something that going to radiotopia.fm or checking out Fugitive Waves will give people everything they need to know. But one last question for you here before I let you go. I'm curious, what interests either one of you outside of the world of audio? Do you guys have another passion? Any big sports fans or big into books or theater? And what else about the Kitchen Sisters beyond the world of audio?
Don't get me started on Steph Curry. Warrior. I'm obsessed with the Warriors. I love basketball, and I love river rafting. I raft wild rivers and have for decades, and that's just something very deep in my soul, as is cooking and food. That's Davia talking.
Nikki?
Well, I'm a pretty big gardener. What?
Nikki's a gift wrapper.
I'm a gift wrapper. I'm a scrapper. I'm a gardener. I like to garden a lot, and also, I mean, we're kind of around here getting ready we're having 3 weddings at our house this summer, my daughter included. So really focused on kind of those kinds of household, bringing it up to par things. And then saving our local radio station where Davia and I started, actually. That's been a big bunch of volunteer time here on my plate, and something I'm real interested in doing, and sort of trying to figure out the future of community radio and its reason for being in communities and in local situations when so much is available online, and when there's competing agencies doing other kinds of programming and you can't really compete. And so what's the reason for a community station, and how the podcast world could work with that, and how we could kind of create a test tube sort of situation and a place for people to come together and share work, and the stations could become very much community places like libraries and as well as broadcasting centers. So that's kind of one of my passions right now.
And birds.
Oh, and birds. And I'm a birder.
Davia's got to throw in the gift wrapping and the birds just to round out the full picture.
Thank you, Dave.
Not together. Don't do them together.
Oh my God, you go out recording with this woman, and she can identify every bird that's in the background while you're doing the recordings. And then she sees the bird. Like, I'm blind as a bat, which if you notice, a lot of podcasters and radio producers are near blind. And I think that's why they're in audio. It's a private theory, but check out how many people have glasses or contacts. But there's Nikki, like she'll see a bird a mile away, or, she's just got that visual thing. So yeah, she's about birds.
And Davia collects sugar. She probably didn't mention that.
Nikki, you have an unannounced side project coming soon, the Bird Watchers podcast, new to Radiotopia.
Exactly.
Well, you mentioned all the great things available online, and that includes the home for all of the great work that you ladies do. One of you jump up, let us know where they can find all the great stuff we've been talking about.
You can go to kitchensisters.org/Fugitive Waves.
And all the links to just about everything we've been talking about, folks, I'm going to put it all in the show notes as well. So as typical, swipe over and check out those. You guys, if you're not already listening to Fugitive Waves or all the Radiotopia shows, you should be. So Davia Nelson, Nikki Silva, thank you both for taking the time and joining me. It's been a real honor.
Well, it's been really fun. Thank you so much.
Dan, thanks so much for having us on your show on the Podcast Digest. I've been saying that name all week. I like that name. Podcast Digest.
Well, thank you.
All right.
It's a spin-off Reader's Digest.
We kind of had that thought. It made,
Yes.
Nathan and I were sitting in the office this week kind of reminiscing about Reader's Digest and its impact on our life. I thought, well, Podcast Digest, perfect.
That was exactly what I was going for. Yep, that was what I was going for. Well, folks, that will do it for this week. This episode of the Podcast Digest. Go check out the Kitchen Sisters and Fugitive Waves. And until next week, my name's Dan Lizette, and I will talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter @PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.